You think you know your neighbors. The couple across the street who wave when you drive by. The single guy who keeps to himself but nods politely when you pass on the sidewalk. The older woman with the roses out front. You think you know them, but in truth, you only know what they let you see. And sometimes, what hides behind those drawn curtains is darker than you could ever imagine. In the quiet suburbs of Los Angeles in the early 2000s, one of those neighbors was Michael Gargiulo. To most people, he was just another face in the sprawl. An average young man in his 20s who fixed air conditioners, went to the gym, and rented a modest place in El Monte. Nothing about him screamed danger. If anything, he was the type of neighbor you'd forget after a handshake. Quiet, almost invisible. But behind that bland exterior, Gargiulo carried something twisted. Sickness. Craving. A compulsion that turned the very idea of neighbor into something sinister. Later, prosecutors would call him the Hollywood Ripper. Reporters would dub him the boy next door killer. And those nicknames weren't exaggerations. They were warnings written too late. Before his name would make headlines, before Ashton Kutcher testified in a trial that shocked the nation, Michael Gargiulo was already building his pattern. Already haunting neighborhoods. Already blending in while hiding the truth. Emily Carter's story, the one about obsession, was a tragedy born of control. But Michael's story? It was about proximity. About the terror of realizing that sometimes the person living just feet from your window, the one you pass in the parking lot, the one whose footsteps you hear in the hallway at night, is a killer. It started years before Los Angeles even knew his name. Back in the Chicago suburb of Glenview, Illinois, 1993. Gargiulo was just a teenager then, 17. And that's where the first whispers of blood began. Across the street lived Tricia Picacho, an 18-year-old with a smile that could light up a graduation stage. She was friendly, popular, the kind of girl who seemed untouchable in her normalcy. But on August 14, 1993, Tricia was found brutally murdered on her own back porch. Stabbed again and again, the violence far beyond what anyone could comprehend. For years, police had no answers. They looked at friends, acquaintances, even people who barely knew Tricia. But suspicion always seemed to hover near one boy, Michael Gargiulo. He lived just across the street. He knew her. He'd been in her house. But there wasn't enough. No witnesses. No hard evidence. And eventually the case went cold. Still, Michael left Illinois not long after, moving west to California. To the sprawling neighborhoods of Los Angeles, where millions of people lived shoulder to shoulder but barely knew each other. A perfect hiding place. A perfect hunting ground. And so began a new chapter. When Michael arrived in LA, he slipped easily into the role of the normal guy. He worked odd jobs. He went to the gym constantly, sculpting his body. He made small talk. To those who crossed paths with him, he seemed polite enough. Maybe a little intense, maybe a little odd, but not dangerous. Nobody knew that under his calm exterior, he had carried that first taste of blood with him from Illinois, and the hunger had only grown stronger. His new neighborhood was safe on the surface. Middle-class families, working professionals, young women chasing their dreams. Nobody suspected that one of their neighbors was watching them with predatory eyes, memorizing routines, waiting for the moment when he could slip from ordinary to monstrous. And then came Ashley Ellerin. Ashley was 22 years old, living in Hollywood, young and vibrant, carving out a life in the city of dreams. She worked in fashion, she modeled, and she was the kind of girl who turned heads without trying. But more than that, she was warm. The type who could make a stranger feel like a friend. And she had just started dating a rising actor. Ashton Kutcher, still at the beginning of his career, not yet the household name he would become. Ashley lived just doors away from Michael Gargiulo. He noticed her. Of course he noticed her. And soon he made himself a fixture. He offered to fix things. To lend a hand. He was there, always around, just close enough to seem helpful, just far enough not to raise suspicion. Ashley likely thought little of it. After all, what's strange about a neighbor offering help? But Michael wasn't helping. He was studying, planning, waiting. The night it happened, February 21, 2001, started out normal for Ashley. She was supposed to meet Kutcher for a night out. He arrived at her home around 10:45 p.m., knocking on the door. No answer. He tried calling. Nothing. Through the window he saw what he thought was spilled wine on the floor. He left, assuming she'd gone out without him. The truth was far more horrifying. Inside that home, Ashley had been brutally attacked. Stabbed 47 times. The crime scene was so violent, so bloody, that detectives later said it looked like the work of pure rage. And yet there was no clear motive. Ashley had no enemies, no disputes. The only common thread? She lived near Michael Gargiulo. But at the time, Michael was just the neighbor. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't even the prime suspect. Ashley's murder remained a mystery, though whispers began circulating about the odd young man who lived close by. Years passed. Michael moved again. Another neighborhood. Another chance to blend in. Another chance to hunt. Maria Bruno was 32. Recently divorced. A mother of 4. She had just moved into a new apartment in El Monte, ready to start fresh, rebuild her life. She didn't know that across the way in the same complex lived Michael Gargiulo. On December 1, 2005, Michael crept into Maria's apartment. What happened next was nothing short of savage. She was stabbed 17 times. Her breasts were mutilated. The crime was shocking not just for its brutality, but for the sheer intimacy of it. It was as though Michael wasn't killing strangers. He was trying to obliterate women he couldn't control. Once again, suspicion flickered. But once again, Michael slipped away. It wasn't until 2008 that his reign of terror began to unravel. And it wasn't because detectives cracked the cold cases. It was because Michael picked the wrong target. That year in Santa Monica, Michael targeted Michelle Murphy, a young woman in her 20s. He broke into her apartment, knife in hand, ready to repeat the same nightmare. But Michelle fought back. She screamed. She scratched. She kicked. And in the chaos, Michael cut himself. His blood spilled in her apartment. Real evidence at last. Michelle survived. Michael fled. But he left behind DNA, the kind of evidence that no alibi, no neighborly smile could erase. And when detectives ran that DNA, it linked him not only to Michelle's attack, but to Maria Bruno, to Ashley Ellerin, to Trisha Picaccio all the way back in Illinois. The trail that began with a teenage girl on her back porch had finally, 15 years later, led straight to Michael Gargiulo. The man who had lived next door. The man who had blended in. The man who waved, who fixed air conditioners, who seemed harmless. He was a serial killer. And when police finally put the pieces together, when they finally saw the web of death that Michael had spun across 2 states and more than a decade, the question wasn't just how many women had died. It was how many others had come close without even knowing it. This is the nightmare of suburbia. It isn't the strangers in the alleyways or the shadows downtown. It's the person whose wall is right against yours. The one whose footsteps you hear through the ceiling. The one whose smile hides the darkest of secrets. And for Ashley, for Maria, for Trisha, the truth came too late. But for Michelle Murphy, who fought back that night in 2008, her courage cracked open the case. And what unfolded from there would reveal just how dangerous Michael Gargiulo truly was. But that's part 2. Because when the trial began, when Ashton Kutcher sat on the witness stand, when the survivors relived their horror in front of the world, the full scope of the boy next door killer would finally be laid bare. And it's darker than anyone imagined. Part 2. The courtroom smelled faintly of coffee and nerves. The kind of room where lives are broken apart piece by piece, where every whispered word matters, and where truth feels heavier than the wooden benches creaking under the weight of the spectators. Michael Gargiulo sat at the defense table, calm, almost eerily so. Dressed neatly in a pressed shirt, his hair combed back, he looked less like a monster and more like a man waiting for a job interview. That was always his trick, to appear ordinary. To look like the guy you'd wave to when you pulled your trash can down the driveway. But the air around him hummed with something else. Something cold. On the opposite side sat the families. Mothers clutching photos, fathers with clenched jaws, siblings staring holes into the man who had destroyed everything. Among them, a woman with trembling hands gripped a tissue until it shredded in her palm. She was the mother of Ashley Ellerin, the young woman who had once laughed about Ashton Kutcher showing up late for their date the night her life ended. And then there was Ashton himself. Hollywood actor. Familiar face. But here, he wasn't the star. He was a witness to a nightmare. When he stepped into that courtroom, the cameras clicked like firecrackers, but his expression said it all. This wasn't about him. This was about her. He testified that on the night of Ashley's murder, he had gone to pick her up for a party. He knocked, waited, tried to call. No answer. peered through the window and thought he saw what looked like spilled wine on the floor. Wine. But it wasn't wine. Hours later, Ashley's body was discovered in her Hollywood Hills home, stabbed 47 times. 47. The courtroom was silent except for Ashton's voice, steady but strained. You could hear the guilt buried in his words, the weight of hindsight crushing him. He had thought she was upset with him, ignoring him. But in reality she was already gone. And Michael Gargiulo, the Hollywood Ripper, had already vanished back into the shadows, blending into the night like he always did. The prosecutors painted a picture not just of murder, but of obsession. They described how Gargiulo prowled, how he watched his victims, how he studied their routines until he knew them better than they knew themselves. He didn't just kill, he hunted. He wasn't called the Ripper for nothing. He carved his violence into their bodies as though proving something to himself, something dark and unspeakable. And then came the testimony that made the room physically shiver. The survivor. Her name was Michelle Murphy. She had been just 26 when she woke to the weight of a man straddling her in bed, knife raised. She had fought back with everything she had, twisting, screaming, clawing. Somehow, miraculously, she had managed to kick him off, and in the struggle he cut himself. He fled, leaving behind a trail of his own blood, DNA that would later connect him to the other murders. Michelle took the stand years later, her voice trembling but strong. She looked Gargiulo in the eye when she said, "You didn't win." But even in her survival, the scars were permanent. She had lived every day since then in the shadow of what could have been her last breath. The defense tried, of course. They called Gargiulo a victim of his upbringing, said he was mentally unstable, incapable of fully understanding his actions. They suggested alternate theories, anything to poke holes in the narrative the prosecution had built. But the jury could see it. They could feel it. This wasn't about instability. This was about control. About power. About a man who liked watching life drain away from the people he decided were his. As the trial stretched on, the families listened to autopsy reports, crime scene photographs, witness after witness. Each detail was a blade cutting deeper into their grief. 47 stab wounds. 30 stab wounds. The language of brutality echoed through the courtroom like a grim chorus. And through it all, Gargiulo sat calm. Sometimes he leaned back, hands folded. Sometimes he tilted his head as if studying the ceiling. But never once did he look broken. Never once did he look like a man who felt the weight of what he had done. The prosecutors called him what he was: a serial killer hiding in plain sight. They told the jury that he thrived on the idea that nobody suspected him. He had lived next door to some of his victims. He had waved at neighbors, helped carry groceries, laughed at block parties, all while harboring the darkest of secrets. When the closing arguments came, the room was electric. The prosecution's voice trembled with passion, with rage that had been building for years. Michael Gargiulo didn't just kill these women, they said. He inserted himself into their lives. He watched them. He waited for them. He decided when their story ended. And then the jury disappeared into deliberation. Hours passed. Then days. Families sat in silence, clinging to each other, praying for a verdict that would finally call this horror by its name. When the jury returned, the air grew thick. You could hear every shuffle, every cough, every creak of the benches. The foreman stood, paper trembling slightly in his hand. Guilty. The word cracked through the room like lightning. Guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Guilty of attempted murder. Guilty of being exactly what he was, the Hollywood Ripper. Ashley's mother wept into her hands. Michelle Murphy exhaled a breath she had been holding for years. Ashton Kutcher sat still, lips pressed tight, eyes fixed on the floor. And Michael Gargiulo? He didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't move. But justice wasn't over. Because this was California. And California still had one more sentence to deliver. When the death penalty was announced, the courtroom was split. Some cried in relief. Some cried in pain. But the truth hung heavy in the air. No sentence, no punishment, no verdict would ever bring Ashley or Trisha or any of the women back. The only thing the trial could do was put a name to the evil that had walked beside them. And as Gargiulo was led away in shackles, the families sat in silence. Justice had been served, but closure? Closure was a word that felt foreign, unreachable. For them, the nightmare would never truly end. Part 3, After the Verdict. The clatter of shackles echoed through the corridor as Michael Gargiulo was led away, his eyes forward, his expression blank. For most men, the pronouncement of the death penalty would have crushed them, would have bent their shoulders under the weight of finality. But Gargiulo was different. To look at him, you might not have known he had just been condemned. There was no regret, no visible fear. Just silence. For the families left behind, though, silence was the enemy. It was the silence of empty bedrooms, of phones that would never ring, of voices that would never echo down a hallway again. Justice may have spoken, but grief doesn't follow court calendars. Grief lingers. It seeps into the walls, it clings to the air. Ashley Ellerin's mother stood outside the courthouse, holding a framed photo of her daughter. The reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. She didn't speak at first. She just clutched the photo like a lifeline, as if holding on to that picture meant holding on to Ashley herself. Finally, she whispered into the chaos. She was only 22. She had her whole life ahead of her. Her words barely carried above the din, but they cut sharper than any headline. For Michelle Murphy, the survivor, life after the verdict was complicated. People called her brave. A hero. The woman who had faced down a serial killer and lived to tell the tale. But when she closed her eyes at night, she didn't feel like a hero. She felt the knife hovering above her chest. She heard his whisper, "Why do you make me do this?" She saw the darkness of his eyes. Every creak of her apartment floorboards, every shadow outside her window pulled her back to that night. Survival, she realized, wasn't an ending. It was a lifetime of learning how to live with what had happened. And what about Ashton Kutcher? Hollywood doesn't pause for grief, but people do. He had been reluctant to testify, knowing the spotlight would shift toward him, knowing headlines would twist the tragedy into something about his connection. But he did it anyway because Ashley deserved nothing less. After the trial, he didn't give interviews. He didn't make statements. He carried the weight quietly, the way survivors often do. And behind the smiles on late-night talk shows, behind the red carpet flashes, the memory of that night, of peering through her window and mistaking blood for spilled wine, haunted him. It always would. The case itself became something more than just the story of one man's crimes. It became a warning, a grim reminder of the predators who live in plain sight. Neighbors, coworkers, friends of friends, people we think we know but don't. Michael Gargiulo had been the boy next door. He had helped carry groceries, waved politely, blended seamlessly into the rhythm of suburban life. And behind that mask of normalcy, he was planning murders. The media called him the Hollywood Ripper. A name fit for headlines, fit for horror movies. But for the families, he wasn't a headline. He wasn't a character. He was the reason their daughters were gone, the reason birthdays passed with empty chairs at the table, the reason every holiday felt incomplete. Psychologists studied him, debated him. Was he a product of childhood trauma? A sociopath born without empathy? Or something darker, something unexplainable? In the end, the labels didn't matter. What mattered were the women he had taken. Ashley Ellerin, Trisha Picaccio, Maria Bruno, countless others who would forever be linked to his name. Years later, as Gargiulo sat on death row, appeals began to circle. Lawyers argued over technicalities, over mental competency, over whether death was the right sentence. The families braced themselves for another endless cycle of hearings, motions, delays. Justice never felt final when paper and procedure could stretch it on indefinitely. But even as the legal system churned, the world outside kept moving. True crime documentaries replayed the story. Podcasts dissected every detail. YouTube channels retold the horror in chilling detail. People consumed the narrative like entertainment. And yet, for the families, it was never a story. It was life before, and life after. Neighbors in the towns where Gargiulo once lived still talk about him in hushed tones. They replay their memories, wondering how they could have missed it. He was quiet, some say. He was polite. Others remember unease. The way his eyes lingered too long, the way he seemed to know too much about their routines. But unease rarely feels like evidence, and nobody wants to believe evil is living next door. Maybe that's the most unsettling truth of all, that monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they mow their lawn at the same time as you. Sometimes they wave as you pick up the mail. Sometimes they live right beside you, waiting for the night when their obsession spills over into violence. For the victims' families, remembering became both a burden and a duty. They told stories of Ashley's laughter, of Trisha's kindness, of Maria's dreams. They spoke their names whenever they could so they wouldn't be reduced to footnotes in a trial transcript. And though their grief never faded, they found some measure of strength in knowing that by telling these stories, they might save someone else from ignoring the warning signs. Because the truth is, killers like Michael Gargiulo don't just appear fully formed. There are red flags. There are patterns, stalking, obsession, control, violence escalating from threats to reality. And too often those signs are brushed aside, dismissed, explained away. In the end, that's what the Hollywood Ripper leaves behind. Not just a legacy of violence, but a mirror held up to the rest of us. How well do we really know the people around us? How often do we listen when someone says they feel unsafe? How often do we silence those instincts that tell us something isn't right? Michael Gargiulo's story isn't just about the women he killed. It's about the silence that surrounded him. The neighbors who wondered but didn't act. The police who needed more evidence before stepping in. The world that thought monsters only existed on movie screens. But monsters live next door. And sometimes by the time we realize it, it's already too late. So tonight, as you sit in your own home, in your own neighborhood, ask yourself, do you really know who lives beside you? Do you really know who watches, who waits, who smiles too long across the fence? Because if there's one thing the story of Michael Gargiulo teaches us, it's that horror doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears the face of a neighbor. Sometimes it lives right across the street. And that is the chilling truth of the killer who lived next door. A suburban nightmare. Thanks for watching. If you stayed to the end, it means you enjoyed our story, so please subscribe to get notifications when we post true stories like this again. And don't forget to like and leave a comment with your thoughts, or suggest true stories you want us to cover next. See you on the next one.